I lived with her for 20 years. We never fought. Everyone saw us as the perfect couple. Then one day, a man came to me and said, I saw your wife. She was kissing a homeless man in an abandoned school. I sat down across from her, looked her in the eyes, and asked, Where were you? She lied to my face. Before we start, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Marshall and Claire lived in Cedar Hill, a quiet little town where nothing really changed and every face felt familiar. They'd been married for over 20 years, and everyone saw them as the perfect example of stability. They didn't fight often, there wasn't any obvious emotional distance, and no one could spot any signs of wear and tear. Their relationship ran so smoothly that, to anybody who knew them, it looked like they'd reached that rare level of closeness that only comes with time and a life free from major disasters. Marshall was a calm, practical, down-to-earth guy. He worked as a maintenance technician for a network of public schools, a job that took organization, sharp attention to detail, and the ability to deal with unexpected problems. He was the kind of person who liked routine more than spontaneity, someone who preferred fixing issues with as little drama as possible. Claire, on the other hand, had a totally different kind of energy, though her values weren't all that different. She chose to be a homemaker and threw herself into community work, especially at church, where she enthusiastically volunteered for all sorts of causes. On Sundays, they were always together at the morning service. During the week, they naturally split up the household duties. Claire kept the house spotless, cooked meals, handled the bills, and still found time to organize charity efforts with the church women's group. Marshall, meanwhile, took care of repairs, made sure bills got paid on time, and always set aside evenings to spend with her. It wasn't unusual to see them taking late afternoon walks, sipping coffee in the backyard on Saturdays, or sitting side by side on the living room couch watching their favorite shows. There was never any awkward silence between them, just comfort, predictability, and a feeling of security that both of them seemed to treasure above everything else. Claire had a reputation around town for her generosity. She was the one who put together charity bazaars, collected food during seasonal drives, and prepared meals that went out to local shelters. But her work with homeless people was probably what hit her hardest emotionally. She didn't just hand out food. She treated them with real care, a kind of compassion that went way deeper. Claire would actually talk to them, ask their names, remember their stories. Whenever a new face showed up in line, she made a point of asking where they came from, if they needed anything else, or if they had a place to sleep that night. Everyone admired that about her, including Marshall, who was proud of his wife's devotion and the way she touched people's lives without ever losing her warmth. She spent countless afternoons at church preparing food baskets, sorting through clothes, organizing lists. And it was during one of those afternoons that Claire met Victor. He showed up for the first time on a cloudy morning at a food distribution event in the church's side courtyard. He was clean, dressed in simple but decent clothes, and there was something in his eyes that set him apart from the others who came around. He didn't seem confused or indifferent. On the contrary, he paid close attention to everything and was very polite. When his turn came, he thanked her for the meal in a steady voice, looked her right in the eyes, and said it had been a long time since he'd eaten something made with such care. She smiled, the same way she smiled at everyone, and gave a kind reply. But even though that first interaction was short, something about the way he carried himself stuck with her for the rest of the day. Victor came back in the following days. He'd sit quietly in a corner, wait his turn, eat without saying much, and always say thank you. Little by little, he started opening up to Claire, first with short sentences, then with small stories. He mentioned he didn't drink, that he stayed at the downtown shelter, and that he loved reading whenever he could get his hands on donated books. She began setting aside specific things just for him, better blankets, fresh pairs of socks, small gestures that to her were just part of the job, but to Victor seemed to mean something more. At first, there was no hint of anything deeper. He was simply one more person Claire helped with all her heart. But something about his calm, respectful gaze, that almost proud posture despite everything he'd been through, started pulling at her attention without her even realizing it. And without knowing it, what began as a simple act of kindness between two strangers was about to turn into something nobody could have predicted. Over the next few weeks, Claire noticed that Victor kept showing up at the church's outreach events. Always clean, always polite, always discreet. He didn't fit any stereotype she had about homeless people. He never asked for more than what was offered. He never pushed for seconds or tried to grab extra items. He accepted everything with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place given where he was in life. Without even noticing, Claire started scanning for him every time she arrived at church. When he was there, she felt strangely more alive. When he didn't show, a quiet unease would follow her until the end of the day. One afternoon, while she was sorting through donated blankets, Victor came up with a shy smile and said she reminded him of somebody. Surprised, Claire asked him to explain. He told her his wife's name was also Claire, and that she'd been a woman with a similar spirit, always involved in social causes. That coincidence opened the door to a much longer conversation. He went on to say that for over 20 years, he'd owned a high-end furniture store. He was married, had his own house, a car, a comfortable life. Then his wife was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm, and after she passed, something inside him just shut down. In a moment of despair, he sold the store, tried investing the money in a badly planned new venture, and lost everything within a few months. Debts piled up, accounts got frozen, and soon he had no home, no savings, nothing. He cut ties with his family, turned down help from friends, and started wandering the streets with no real direction. He didn't drink, didn't do drugs, wasn't violent. He just gave up on a life that, for him, only made sense when she was around. Claire listened without saying a word. And right there, for the first time, something inside her changed in a different way. It wasn't just pity. It was recognition. It was the feeling of seeing in Victor a kind of silent grief she'd never gone through herself, but somehow understood. In the days after that, she started putting aside better food for him, preparing extra portions and saying it was just leftovers, and suggesting he stay a little longer after distributions to help tidy up the tables. Nobody thought that was strange. She'd always been close to the people she helped. But the frequency with which they started talking would have raised some eyebrows if anyone had been paying closer attention. Time went on, and their conversations got deeper. Victor talked about life before his collapse, about dreams that got cut short, about the pain that still came up when he remembered his wife. Claire, in turn, began sharing personal stuff she usually kept to herself. She opened up about her life with Marshall, how sometimes she felt invisible, how her daily routine lacked any real novelty. She wasn't bad-mouthing her husband. She was just being honest about how she felt. Victor listened with patient eyes, like someone who understood what it was like to feel trapped in a quiet existence. And in that space of listening and empathy, a certain intimacy started to form. It wasn't physical at first, but slowly, it began taking up dangerous room inside her. Their first meeting away from church happened completely by accident. Claire was walking back from a pharmacy, and when she turned onto a side street a bit further from downtown, she spotted Victor sitting under a tree, reading a book. He smiled when he saw her and stood up naturally. They chatted for a few minutes. She offered him a piece of fruit from her bag, and he took it. They sat down on a nearby bench and kept talking, as if it were just part of their normal routine. From that day on, more encounters started happening. At first, they lined up with church events. But later, they started meeting at times that had nothing to do with the church schedule. Claire picked neutral, quiet spots, always telling herself that she was still just listening to someone who needed to be heard. But she knew. She knew this connection had stopped being about volunteer work. She knew it wasn't just empathy anymore. The way she looked at Victor had changed, and so had the way she got ready to see him. She started spending more time on her hair, choosing her outfits more carefully, wearing perfume, things she hadn't even done for Sunday services. And Victor changed too. He began complimenting her, remembering little details from their conversations, searching for her with eager eyes. There was no single moment when everything crossed the line. It was a slow, quiet slide, like walking with your eyes wide open towards something you know you shouldn't, but just can't stop. Their first kiss happened in a side hallway at the shelter where Claire volunteered once a week. She'd brought a box of donations to the storage room, and Victor was there helping her organize things. They talked about ordinary stuff, laughed at something trivial, and when they both turned to leave, he held her arm for just a second too long. She didn't pull back. And then it happened. It wasn't impulsive or rushed. It was calm, almost reverent. And contrary to what she expected, Claire didn't feel immediate guilt. She felt peace, a kind of inner quiet she hadn't realized she'd been looking for until that very moment. From then on, their meetings became more regular, always brief, always in discreet places, always carrying the risk of being caught, but never really planned. Everything was driven by that need to be together, by an urgency they both knew wouldn't lead anywhere good, but neither could stop it. For the first few months, Claire kept up her routine just like always. She left for church at the same times, came back with the same calm attitude, took care of the house, and gave nobody a reason to suspect a thing. Marshall didn't suspect a thing. His wife's behavior looked exactly the same as ever, and there were no sudden changes that might have raised an alarm. But other people involved in church activities started noticing small things. Thomas, a fellow church member and volunteer, began to realize that Claire kept disappearing for longer stretches during meal distributions. She'd say she was organizing donations or handling something urgent, but some of those excuses didn't match up with how long she was gone. He also noticed that whenever Victor was around, Claire seemed more animated, and the two of them talked privately a lot more than seemed normal. His discomfort grew. Thomas knew Claire well and respected her reputation, but something about their closeness bothered him. One day, Claire left church at an unusual time with no event on the schedule. Thomas, who happened to be nearby, felt a gut instinct he couldn't ignore and decided to follow her. He kept his distance, staying out of sight. Claire walked a few blocks and met Victor in front of an old abandoned school. They talked, looked around, and quietly slipped through a side entrance. Thomas crept closer. Through a gap in the rusted gate, he saw them hugging. A few seconds later, they kissed, naturally, like it was something they'd done before. There was no doubt left, it was an affair. He walked away quietly, shaken. He knew he couldn't just pretend he hadn't seen it. The next afternoon, he went to Marshall's house. They sat on the porch like they'd done many times, but what Thomas had to say didn't match that peaceful setting. Clearly and respectfully, he told Marshall everything he'd witnessed. Marshall listened in complete silence, not interrupting once. He sat completely still, like he was absorbing every word but didn't want to believe any of it. When Thomas finished, Marshall thanked him, stood up, and said goodbye. He walked into the house with a blank stare and a stiff posture. Marshall found Claire in the kitchen, absent-mindedly moving pots around like she was trying to stay busy so she wouldn't have to think. He pulled out a chair and, with a calmness that somehow felt scarier than yelling, told her to sit down. The silence between them was thick. Claire, uncomfortable, obeyed. "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" he asked, staring straight at her. She paused for a moment, like she needed a second to come up with something. "I stopped by my sister's house after church," she said, her voice steady, trying to sound believable. Marshall didn't look away. "Are you sure about that?" he pressed, keeping his tone flat. "Of course I am," she shot back, now annoyed, trying to turn it around. "Are you really questioning my word?" He took a deep breath, rested his elbows on the table, and let the silence hang for a few seconds. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "You know, Claire, people came to me. People who respect me, who have no reason to make up stories. And they told me you were at the school kissing Victor." It was like the ground dropped out from under her. The color left her face, and for a few seconds, she couldn't react. She tried to laugh nervously. "That's ridiculous. You're actually buying into gossip," she said, her eyes filling with tears, still clinging to the lie. Marshall didn't answer. He just kept looking at her. The weight of his silence was more crushing than any accusation. Claire started to shake. She brought her hands to her face, and finally, the tears poured out. "I didn't want it to be like this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear, I didn't plan any of this." She sobbed, words tumbling out in desperation. "I made a mistake, Marshall. I lost my way. But I never stopped loving you. It was a mistake. A stupid mistake." He listened until she was done, unmoving like a statue. When she reached out to touch his hand, he pulled away. "You need to pack your things, Claire, today." His voice was low but carried a firmness that left zero room for argument. "And I won't hide this. The church will know. In 2 days, I'm filing for separation." Claire cried and begged for another chance, saying she could change, that there was still time to fix the marriage. But Marshall just stood up, turned, and walked out of the kitchen without a backward glance. She stayed behind, slumped over the table, her sobs echoing through the quiet house, knowing that nothing she said would change his mind. Claire left the house that same day, taking only a few suitcases with clothes and paperwork. She had nowhere to go right away, so she checked into a small hotel downtown, using some of her personal savings. The loneliness was crushing, but there was no time for long regrets. The next morning, she messaged the church leadership asking for a meeting. She wanted to explain herself, hoping she might still be able to keep her volunteer position. She still clung to the hope that she might find some kindness there. The reply came fast. They scheduled the meeting for a week later in a room at the back of the church. Claire arrived early, looking exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. The meeting was short and blunt. The leaders already knew everything, and while they hadn't made any public judgments, they decided she could no longer take part in outreach activities. They explained that, given the internal fallout, her continued involvement would cause discomfort, tension, and push other volunteers away. They said they'd pray for her healing, but it would be best if she stepped aside indefinitely. Claire didn't argue. She just nodded and left before the tears could expose her even more. Without a home, and without the church, she had only one option left: her parents' house. She hadn't spent more than a few hours with them in years, and even that was only during formal occasions like religious holidays. She knew she wouldn't be warmly received, but she had no choice. She called her mother late that afternoon and told her everything. The response was a few seconds of silence, followed by a heavy sigh. They said she could come, but not to expect a warm welcome. When Claire arrived that evening, her father greeted her coldly. No hug, no comforting words. Her mother, though a bit more restrained, made it clear they were deeply ashamed. At dinner, they laid out the rules plainly. She could stay for a maximum of 6 months, long enough to find work, save some money, and move on. They wouldn't help with contacts or recommendations. This was her chance to start over, on her own. Claire listened quietly, knowing she deserved every word. The bed she slept in was from her old childhood room, now used as a storage space. There was no room for fond memories there, just a place to sleep while she tried to rebuild something from the pieces that were left. The next week, she started job hunting. She sent resumes to supermarkets, stores, bakeries. She knocked on doors, asking for any opportunity. But her name was already going around town. A lot of people knew about the scandal, even if nobody talked about it openly. And that meant closed doors. Some said the position was already filled. Others just turned her down without any explanation. The shame was constant. She'd see faces that used to greet her at church look away when they spotted her on the street. Old friends vanished. Nothing from her old life remained. With no formal options, she started taking whatever odd jobs she could find. She began cleaning houses for acquaintances who, out of pity, offered her work with no questions asked. Then she took on laundry and other small tasks at odd hours. The money was meager, barely enough to cover basic needs, but it was enough to buy hygiene products, pay for the occasional meal out, and slowly set aside a tiny bit of savings. After 4 months, she'd saved just enough to take the next step, renting a tiny studio apartment on the edge of a neighborhood far from anything that reminded her of her past. The place was cramped, with peeling paint, hand-me-down furniture, and poor airflow. But it was hers. For the first time in months, Claire had a key, a bed, a corner where she could exist without the daily weight of judgment. She still struggled, still relied on sporadic work, still cried in private. But now there was at least a thread of independence, even if it was thin. The wounds were far from healed, and loneliness stuck to her like a shadow. Still, inside that cramped little space, she started to understand what it meant to live without applause, without praise, without the reputation that had once held her up, just herself. Claire's fall dragged others down with her in different ways. Victor, who had once been seen as a rare example of dignity and gratitude among the homeless, became the target of suspicious stares. Church leadership didn't waste time. They met privately and discreetly informed him that he could no longer attend the charity events there. The reason was simple: no explanations, no ceremony. His presence had stirred up internal problems, and the church couldn't afford another scandal. Victor listened without reacting. He just nodded and walked away, carrying his small bag of belongings. In the days after, he was spotted again near the municipal shelter, but he stopped approaching missions or church-run food distribution points. He didn't try to reach out to Claire or publicly defend what had happened. He just faded back into the city's corners with the same quietness he'd first appeared with. It was like he accepted the return to anonymity as something inevitable. No drama, no promises to change, just the silence of someone who knows their time in a certain place is over. He was back to square one, but now without the only support system that had ever reached out to him. Claire, meanwhile, stayed isolated in her new reality. The studio she lived in was a world away from the life she used to know. No visitors, no phone calls, no invitations. Her days were filled with physical labor and a loneliness that felt even heavier at night, when the silence of the apartment seemed to magnify everything she'd lost. For a while, she tried to find comfort in reading Bible passages, but the words felt hollow. The place where she'd once found faith now brought only discomfort. She couldn't walk into a church without feeling eyes on her, real or imagined. The spirituality that had once driven her had become painful territory. She didn't say she was turning away from God, but she had no idea how to reconnect. On those rare occasions when she ran into someone from her past, the greetings were cold and mechanical. Nobody attacked her openly, but the rejection was clear. She lived like a ghost of who she used to be, with no plans to go back, no hope of making things right. Her days followed predictable cycles, focused on survival, haunted by memories that refused to fade. She was fully aware of the choices she'd made, and while she didn't see herself as a victim, the pain of being shut out was unavoidable. She knew that earning back trust was probably impossible, and maybe that's why she stopped trying altogether. Marshall, on the other hand, didn't stay frozen in time, but he wasn't unscathed either. A few months after the divorce, he switched churches, looking for a fresh start away from the memories that clung to him. In the new congregation, he was polite and helpful, but kept a clear emotional distance. He avoided talking about the past, and when asked, he'd simply say he'd been through a difficult separation. He never gave details, never badmouthed Claire, but his eyes told the story of a man still carrying open wounds. The members of his new church respected his silence, but it was impossible to miss the hardness that had crept into his demeanor. Once warm, now guarded. Once open, now closed off. He was a changed man, shaped not by anger, but by pain. The years that followed passed quietly for all three. Claire never tried to contact Marshall again. Victor stayed on the streets, and nobody from the religious community ever heard from him again. Marshall rebuilt parts of his life, but he never remarried, not because he lacked opportunities, but because he seemed to have closed that chapter for good. People would quietly remark that he still carried a love that had been deeply betrayed, but he never confirmed it. This story, which started as a reflection of generosity and faith, ended as a painful illustration of how quiet decisions can lead to permanent fractures. There were no loud fights, no public spectacles, just bad choices, poorly guarded secrets, and consequences that, once set in motion, could never be undone. Trust, as many whispered, is like a mirror. Once it's broken, even if you glue it back together, it'll never look the same again.